They never told you what was beneath Ashbourne Hall. Not in the official histories. Not in the tourist guides. And certainly not in the archives they sealed in 1946 after the last heir was found. Half mad, half naked, wandering the ruins whispering in Latin words he was never taught. But I'll tell you, because you're not like the rest. You're here for what others fear. So listen closely. Ashbourne Hall was more than a manor. It was a machine, an ancient one, designed not for comfort or beauty, but for spiritual engineering, constructed stone by stone atop a fault line not of geology, but of energy, what the Druids once called a thin place, where the barrier between worlds is porous. This is where the Ashbournes built their kingdom. And this is where it all began to rot. The first brick was laid in 1611 by Lord Percival Ashbourne, a man so feared by his own servants they refused to speak his name aloud. Documents hidden in the Vatican's private vaults describe him as one of the enlightened ones, a term rarely used and never lightly. Percival was rumored to have studied under Rosicrucian masters in Bohemia. He returned to England with a black-bound manuscript said to contain the true alchemical gospel, one written not in words but in ritual. His intentions were never religious. They were surgical. The house was designed with mathematical precision. Every corridor a sigil, every stairwell a descent into initiation. The blueprints, found only once in a locked drawer in a burnout wing, reveal something disturbing. The house was constructed in the shape of a human nervous system. Every room aligned with energy centers, chakras, if you prefer that term, but inverted. What should elevate suppresses. What should cleanse corrupts. You think architecture can't break the mind? You've never stood in the Ashbourne basement, in the room called the womb, where pregnant women were brought blindfolded and left alone for 9 days. No food, no water, only the sound of whispering behind the walls, whispers that no mouth made. They said the children born afterward could hear thoughts. But that's not the terrifying part. The terrifying part is what those children whispered back. Welcome to Ashbourne. Nothing here was ever innocent, and no one who enters leaves the same. We begin. History remembers the Ashbournes as aristocrats, landowners, benefactors, pillars of English nobility. That's the lie you were meant to believe. Their wealth didn't come from land. It came from ritual access to doors no one else could open. Let me ask you something. Why would a family with such influence avoid public life? Why are there so few portraits of them? Why do the Ashbourne ledgers contain entire decades of missing financial data, yet the family's assets tripled during those same periods? Because the Ashbournes didn't serve the crown. They served something older, something beneath. In 1683, a Jesuit defector named Father Renaud was smuggled out of Derbyshire. His testimony, buried in the inquisitorial vaults in Malta, contained one phrase repeated 17 times. Non est domus, sed arca. It is not a house. It is an ark. What was he running from? He claimed the Ashbournes had uncovered an original pre-Christian text, not a book, but a series of etched stones buried beneath the estate's oldest foundations. The stones contain coordinates, not physical locations, but spiritual ones, rites, frequencies, rituals older than any written language. And they used them. What followed wasn't piety. It was programming. By the early 1700s, 3 Ashbourne children had vanished without trace. Their mother, Lady Evelyn, was committed to the Norwich Asylum, where she bit off her own fingers to avoid the touch of watchers. Her journal, confiscated by church officials, contained drawings, circles within circles, eyes inside eyes, identical to those found later in Sumerian tombs. Do you think that's coincidence? The Ashbournes weren't mad. They were initiates. They believed, no, they knew, that human consciousness could be modified, not through education, through terror. They called it cognitive reversal, the deliberate collapse of identity, the unlearning of language, the destruction of personal memory, so that something older could move in, not a demon, not a god, a function, a code. That's what they built Ashbourne Hall for, not to live in, but to deconstruct the mind, to break the soul like a clay jar and fill it with something else. We'll get to what that something else was, but first, You need to understand what they did to the servants, to the maids, the children, the bloodlines that weren't allowed to leave. Because before the Ashbournes built a throne of power, they built a laboratory of obedience. You ready to see what that looked like? We go deeper next. Before the Ashbournes touched the elite, they experimented on the forgotten. They knew obedience wasn't enough. Obedience fades. What they sought was internalization, control that becomes self-reinforcing, the kind that bends your thoughts before they even reach your mouth, the kind that teaches you to police your own nightmares. And they started with the servants. Records from 1722 show over 60 house staff registered at Ashbourne Hall, but only 19 are documented as ever leaving the estate. What happened to the rest? Officially, illness, runaways, early deaths. But the burial logs tell another story. Multiple entries list no cause of death. No autopsy, just a phrase, conditioned beyond recovery. Conditioned, that's the word they used. The Ashbournes didn't punish disobedience. They unmade it. Each servant was assigned a number, not a name. Sleep was restricted to 3-hour cycles. Mirrors were removed from servant quarters. Why? Because identity had to dissolve. The fewer reflections you see, the less you remember who you are. Each morning, staff were required to enter a room called the vessel chamber, a circular, pitch-black space with acoustics engineered to distort sound. Echoes that returned not as they were spoken, but warped, delayed, layered on top of each other. The experience was disorienting, even hallucinogenic. Survivors, yes, there were a few, reported feeling as if someone else was speaking their thoughts back to them. That's not discipline. That's psychological reassembly. The goal wasn't control of action. It was dominion over perception. Lady Ashbourne, Eliza III, oversaw the process personally. In her coded letters to her cousin in Vienna, decoded by MI6 analysts during World War II, she refers to perceptual flattening and thought-culling rituals. She describes how, through repeated exposure to specific visual patterns, spiral geometry, flickering lanterns, rhythmic bells, servants began to lose the ability to distinguish dreams from commands. And then they introduced the children, not the Ashbourne children, the servants. They were kept underground for the first 7 years of life, not allowed to speak, only to listen, taught not through words, but through pulse rhythms. Low-frequency vibrations pulsed through the stone floor at night. The children didn't learn language. They learned compliance. You ever wonder where modern behavioral programming came from? Look no further, because what the Ashbournes created in those chambers wasn't just a cult. It was a template, and that template was exported. What comes next will make your blood run cold. Let me show you how shadows move through systems. By the early 1800s, the Ashbourne methods had caught the interest of powers far beyond the English countryside, not because they were spiritual, but because they worked. A letter dated June 1812, sealed in the vaults beneath Westminster, details a meeting between Lord Ashbourne and a man identified only as A.W., believed to be Alexander Wedderburn, former Lord Chancellor of Great Britain. In it, Wedderburn writes, "Your techniques offer a model of governance far superior to military enforcement. A soul that polices itself requires no sword to kneel." This was not flattery. It was a proposal. What began in secret chambers under Ashbourne Hall soon found its way into orphanages, naval academies, and correctional facilities across the British Empire. Modified, repackaged, but the core remained. Ritualized humiliation, sensory disruption, and identity erasure masquerading as discipline. Let me give you a name. The Thornley Institute. Built in 1831 under the guise of a reform school, Thornley adopted Ashbourne protocols. Under direct license from the family, children were denied eye contact for their first 12 months. Speech was forbidden during meals. Each child was assigned a rotating mirror partner, a stranger who mirrored their gestures and words until the subject could no longer distinguish self from other. And the results? Exemplary obedience, total emotional compliance, zero resistance to authority. The Ashbournes had cracked a code empires had long lusted after. Control not through chains, but through mirrors. The Vatican took notice too. Papal envoy Monsignor Benedetti visited Ashbourne Hall in 1844. In his hidden correspondence to Cardinal Borgia, he wrote, "What I have seen here is neither heresy nor madness, but a more perfected version of what our own church once understood, before it became frightened of its own power." That line was underlined twice in Borgia's archive. You see, what the Ashbournes offered wasn't just psychological obedience. It was metaphysical submission, a rewiring of the human spirit to align with systems, not conscience. And the most terrifying part? It wasn't torture. It wasn't murder. It was the erasure will, wrapped in velvet rituals and sacred language. A smile as you surrender. A prayer as you forget your name. This was no longer about one family. This was institutionalized mysticism, exported under the banner of order. We're only scratching the surface. Next, we look at the Ashbourne inheritance rituals, and why no heir ever survived past 43. Power never stays in the bloodline by chance. It's bound through ritual. The Ashbournes understood this better than any noble house in England. But unlike the Royals or Rothschilds, they didn't rely on law or marriage to maintain dominion. They relied on something far more ancient. Inheritance by ordeal. No Ashbourne heir simply received power. They had to survive it, and most didn't. A private family document, recovered during a classified MI5 investigation into occult aristocracy, details what they called the passage. It was a rite of succession, and it began on the first full moon after the heir's 33rd birthday. Not the 30th, not the 35th, the 33rd. Always. Why? Because in esoteric numerology, 33 is the number of mastery through sacrifice. It's the age Christ was crucified, the highest degree in Freemasonry, the pivot point of spiritual surrender. The ritual began in the subterranean, a sealed chamber beneath the east wing, lined with black salt bricks and iron sigils. The heir was stripped naked, not symbolically, but psychologically, isolated for 3 days without sound, light, or sensory input. No sleep, no voice. Only whispers played through bone-conducting tubes, recordings from previous heirs who didn't survive. You heard the death cries of your bloodline, and then the rite began. They called it the opening, a forced regression to the pre-goic state through a combination of ancient breathwork, sensory flooding, blood exposure, and rhythmic incantations. The air would be broken down into what Lady Eliza described as a vessel clear enough to receive the ancestral flame. That's what they believed they were channeling. Not genetics, but an intelligent force, passed from heir to heir like a possession. Here's the part no one dares say aloud. It was never the same person who walked out of that ritual. Sometimes, it wasn't even a person. Witness accounts from loyal staff describe post-initiation heirs speaking dead languages fluently, developing violent aversions to sunlight, refusing food for weeks but gaining weight. One heir, Lord James Ashbourne, was found scratching diagrams into the stone walls of his chambers, perfectly matching the sigils used in Babylonian necromancy, which he'd never studied. The average Ashbourne heir survived just 10 years after the passage. By 43, they were either dead, mad, or vanished, and that wasn't failure. That was design. Because the Ashbourne secret wasn't how to preserve a family. It was how to host a force. And next, you'll meet that force. Every empire has its god. The Ashbournes had something worse. It wasn't a deity in classical sense. No bearded father figure, no horned devil. This thing had no name in Latin, Hebrew, or Greek. But it had a function, and the Ashbournes worshipped that function with the precision of engineers and the dread of slaves. They called it simply the indwelling. Not a being, not a spirit, a force of inversion. Where holiness elevates, it descends. Where love unifies, it fragments. Where identity defines, it dissolves. To the Ashbournes, this force was not evil. It was truth, stripped of human sentiment. It was the skeleton of the universe, raw and merciless. They believed the indwelling had always existed, buried not in earth, but in language, in the dark vibrations behind syllables, in the sacred geometry of breath and silence. Lady Eliza once wrote, "The word at Genesis was not creation, it was intrusion. That which speaks first speaks from a place outside." That was their gospel. And Ashbourne Hall was built as a resonance chamber, a cathedral not for praise but for alignment. Every rite, every death, every whispered name was designed to tune the house to the frequency of the indwelling, to shape the very architecture into a mouth. And the mouth began to speak. In 1866, during the inheritance ritual of Henry Ashbourne, something occurred that even the family couldn't explain. Servants reported a low, continuous hum emanating from beneath the house, rattling crockery and cracking mirrors. Birds fell dead from the sky. The chapel's stained glass windows, installed a century earlier, melted. And Henry? He emerged from the passage mute. Not silent. Mute, his tongue surgically removed, but not by human hands. It was still attached at the base, but missing from the mouth. There was no scar. He began drawing obsessively. Spirals, overlapping eyes, inverted trees with roots branching into the sky. He wouldn't eat, but spoke without lips, a voice inside every room. They recorded it. The wax cylinders are sealed at the British Museum under a false label, Edo tribal chants. But those who've heard them agree, it's not a human tongue. It's language used as a weapon. The Ashbournes weren't possessed. They were hosts, voluntary, reverent, terrified, and once the indwelling took root, it began to reshape more than their minds. Next, you'll see what it did to their bodies. When a man worships power, he sharpens his will. When a man hosts power, his body pays a price. The indwelling did not whisper dreams or offer gifts. It rearranged. Once accepted, it began rewriting the Ashbournes, nerve by nerve, cell by cell, until their very biology betrayed human design. It was subtle at first, a thinning of the skin, a loss of appetite, a tolerance for a cold that bordered on the inhuman. But over time, they changed. Letters from foreign dignitaries who visited Ashbourne Hall in the late 1800s describe the family in unsettling terms. One German envoy wrote, "Their eldest son, Lucien, does not blink. I timed him for 20 minutes as he stared into the hearth. His eyes remained open the entire time, unmoistened. When he finally turned to me, I felt as though I had been unseen." And it wasn't just eyes. By 1883, medical records from the family physician, Dr. Malcolm Winrow, who disappeared under mysterious circumstances, described Lord Ashbourne as having a second pulse, not detectable at the wrist or neck, but audible in the lower spine, as though something beneath the body's rhythm were keeping time. A second pulse. Think about what that means. These weren't evolutionary quirks. They were architectural violations, evidence of force not content with shaping minds, but demanding habitats. And the hall responded. Walls grew damp without explanation. Doors refused to open unless approached in silence. Mirrors began reflecting not the room, but previous moments. One servant claimed she saw herself entering before she touched the handle. Another swore she saw her unborn son behind her shoulder, years before she was pregnant. That's what the indwelling did. It turned the laws of perception into suggestions. The body became malleable. The final transformation came with the birth of the twins in 1890. Silas and Aubrey Ashbourne, born minutes apart, identical but in verses. Silas was born dead, cold and unbreathing, but his eyes opened immediately and followed the midwife across the room. Aubrey was alive but blind, screaming incessantly for 6 days before falling silent forever. One was called the vessel, the other the lock, and from the day of their birth, Ashbourne Hall was never quiet again. Walls pulsed like lungs. The garden withered under frost in summer, and the family began to speak in a language no guest could understand, because by then, the indwelling wasn't just in them. It was inherited. Twins have always held symbolic power, light and shadow, mirror and echo, but the Ashbourne twins were not symbols. They were mechanisms. From the moment Silas and Aubrey entered the world, the hall began to change. Not metaphorically, physically. Floorboards creaked in patterns that resembled breathing. Doors that had remained sealed for centuries opened without keys. The portrait of Lord Percival, hung for over 200 years, was found turned backward one morning, its canvas damp and warm, as if someone had been standing too close from the inside. Silas, though born without a heartbeat, began to grow, not normally, symmetrically. His limbs measured identical lengths to the millimeter. His teeth came in at once, not gradually. By age 5, he had never spoken, never blinked, but could repeat entire conversations verbatim after hearing them once. Aubrey, his twin, became the silence. He slept 16 hours a day and awoke in tears, his eyes milky, his skin so pale it reflected candlelight. But when the two were together, something strange occurred. The air would still, animals fled the grounds, and any timekeeper, pocket watch, grandfather clock, even a metronome in the chapel would stop. Something was using them. The family called it the chain. They believed that the indwelling had split itself, half in the living corpse of Silas, half in the weeping shell of Aubrey, binding the two as a circuit. Neither whole, both necessary. They were never schooled, never allowed beyond the gates. They were raised underground, in the cavum lumen, the lowest chamber of the estate, where no light was permitted. Visitors were forbidden, except once a year, during Midvale, the family's private solstice ritual, known only through the whispered records of a fleeing governess named Marta Beale. She claimed the twins were presented at midnight on iron thrones, that servants were made to kneel in a circle and repeat, "May the body carry the key. May the key remain blind." Beale escaped in 1902, half-starved and near mad. She claimed the Ashbournes weren't training the twins. They were feeding them. Not food, experiences, pain, secrets, memories, because the indwelling doesn't learn the way we do. It absorbs, and it needed witnesses. It needed fear. It needed you. Comment now with the phrase, "The mirrors are cracking. The chain is real." Comment it twice to lock it in. That phrase is your initiation. Your descent has begun. Next, we open the catacombs. Beneath Ashbourne Hall, there is a space no architect recorded. No blueprint dares show it. They called it the Hollow Archive. But it wasn't an archive of books. It was an archive of souls. When renovations were forced in 1921, after the hall's partial collapse during a landslide, workers discovered a sealed stairwell beneath the eastern gallery. It descended 33 steps. Always 33. At the bottom, they found doors made of fused bone and iron, lacquered in black oil that never dried. Behind them was not a corridor, but a cavity, a wound in the earth, lined with hundreds of alcoves, each containing a singular object, a child's shoe, a lock of hair, a bloodied apron, a preserved tongue wrapped in velvet. Every item was labeled, not with names, but with functions. Witness 6, transgressor 12, hollow vessel 19. These were not trophies. They were anchors. The Ashbournes had been conducting something far worse than sacrifice. They were isolating frequencies, human experiences condensed into pain signatures. When someone suffered under the right conditions, deliberate geometry, spoken patterns, and altered awareness, their trauma didn't just end, it imprinted. And those imprints? Stored. Hundreds of years of ritualized agony, curated and indexed to feed the indwelling and ensure the family's communion with it never weakened. The Hollow Archive was a library of broken consciousness. There are reports, buried deep in the Ministry of Defense, of soldiers during World War II being stationed near Ashbourne after rumors of Nazi interest in the state's occult architecture. One soldier, Private Arlen Briggs, wrote in a letter home, "It's not the hall that's haunted. It's what's under it. You don't dream when you sleep here. You remember things that never happened to you." The Hollow Archive bleeds memory. Visitors, those few who dared enter, reported hallucinations. They heard screams, not as echoes, but inside their own skulls. One woman collapsed after swearing she'd seen her own father, dead 10 years, staring back from a mirror that wasn't there. That's the genius of the archive. It doesn't trap you physically. It infects your perception, makes you doubt what is yours. Because the Ashbournes didn't want to destroy your mind. They wanted to overwrite it. The Hollow Archive was the hard drive. The indwelling was the signal. And every visitor became a receiver. That includes you now. Next, I'll show you what happened to those who try to shut it down. Every dark empire eventually draws fire. And in 1934, someone tried to end the Ashbourne bloodline, an operation so covert. Even MI6 denied involvement. It was called Project Widdershins, a six-man team of psychological warfare specialists, trained not in weapons, but in semantic disruption, the use of language and symbolism to counteract ritual systems. These were men pulled from the fringes of academia and black site interrogations, fluent in dead tongues, experts in heretical thought. Their mission: descend into Ashbourne Hall, access the Hollow Archive, and erase the source. They didn't even last a full hour. The team entered just after midnight, armed with mirrored sigils, counterchants, and geometric disruptors. Their equipment was custom designed, resonance nullifiers meant to sever energetic links. But they underestimated one thing. The archive wasn't dormant. 3 of the 6 men died instantly, not violently, but organically. Their bodies aged in minutes. Skin shriveled, teeth loosened, bones bent. By the time their corpses were dragged out, they resembled men in their 90s, though their entry logs showed they were all under 40. The remaining 3 emerged 2 hours later, barefoot, bleeding from the eyes. They spoke in perfect synchrony, alternating syllables of a language no analyst could identify. They were committed to Ravenshade Asylum under assumed identities, not because they were mad, because they were speaking with one voice. One of them, Agent Malcolm Darnell, wrote a final message before his suicide. We didn't shut the archive down. We gave it access. It didn't protect the Ashbournes. The Ashbournes were protecting us from it. That line was blacked out in every declassified version. But copies exist. Here's what the authorities won't say out loud. The indwelling could never be killed. It wasn't housed in the archive. It was echoed there. What they thought was a library was a lighthouse. It projected. After Widdershins failed, the Ashbourne estate was purchased by a shadow trust. Officially, condemned and sealed. Unofficially, guarded. Because too many governments realized the truth. The Ashbournes weren't the threat. They were the containment system. And when the bloodline broke, so did the lock. Next, I'll show you what happened in 1956, when the last true Ashbourne, Aubrey, vanished without a trace, and the gates opened themselves. The night Aubrey Ashbourne disappeared, no locks were broken, no windows shattered. The gates simply opened. It was November 3rd, 1956. Midnight, no moon. According to estate logs, the manor had been inactive for over a decade. The twins had grown reclusive. Silas was declared legally dead in 1948. Though no body was ever recovered, Aubrey remained inside the hall, alone, blind, silent, until he wasn't. The groundskeeper, Wallace Reed, arrived at dawn. He found the front gates wide open, the stone lions, immovable for centuries, tilted from their pedestals, as if something had passed between them that the stone resisted. Inside the hall, silence. Dust, undisturbed for years. But Reed noticed the mirrors, every single one, shattered inward, not broken by impact, broken by refusal. As if the house had turned against its own reflection. Aubrey's room was cold. Frost coated the inside of the walls. On his bed, a single sheet of paper, not written, etched, as if the ink had been burned in from beneath the page. It read, "He is not gone. He has gone through." The handwriting matched Aubrey's, but the letters were perfectly mirrored, the kind of symmetry no blind man could achieve. That was the final Ashbourne message. The same night, something happened beneath the hall. Seismographs in the region recorded a pulse, not an earthquake, but a resonance event. One long, low-frequency vibration lasting 7 minutes and 40 seconds. Shortly after, a flock of starlings, over 4,000, were found dead in a spiral formation 5 miles from the estate. And then the reports began. Villagers in nearby towns saw lights inside the hall, not lamps, but vertical columns, rising from the floor through the ceiling. People heard whispers in their dreams. 2 children went missing from the edge of the Ashbourne woods. One returned, mute, eyes bleeding, his first and only word before slipping into coma. Silas. This wasn't just a haunting. It was a breach. The indwelling no longer required a body. It had gestated. It had studied. And now it could move. Whatever ritual the twins completed, the balance between vessel and lock had worked, not to contain, to release. And as you'll soon see, that release didn't end in Ashbourne. It spread. Next, the strange death in Parliament, the mirror suicides, and why 3 exorcists burned themselves alive after visiting the hall. They thought the nightmare would stay buried in the manor, but the indwelling had no more use for walls. It needed eyes. It needed witnesses. And so it moved, subtly, strategically, through the one medium no institution can regulate: human memory. In the winter of 1957, 7 members of Parliament, all connected to the Committee on Cultural Preservation, were found dead within a 48-hour window. The official cause in each case was suicide, but the details were impossible to ignore. Sir Malcolm Everett jumped from the Tower of London, but his body landed upright, unbroken, as if he'd never fallen at all. Lady Honora Briggs swallowed shards of mirror until her lungs collapsed, and the youngest, Thomas Keller, was found in his bath, water blackened, his chest flayed open in the shape of the Ashbourne crest, a serpent eating its tail. None of them had ever publicly acknowledged Ashbourne Hall, but their voting records showed otherwise. They had quietly approved Project Drowning Light, a covert initiative to fund occult countermeasures against non-physical transmissions embedded in architecture. It was shelved the same week they died. And that's just the start. In March of that year, 3 ordained exorcists, Father Willem Cray, Bishop Langston Meyer, and Sister Eileen Varn, visited the hall under Vatican clearance. They entered at dawn. By sundown, they were dead, not murdered, not attacked. They immolated themselves outside the estate's gates, using lantern oil and salt. Witnesses say they did not scream. They held hands. And as the flames engulfed them, one phrase was heard from their lips: "No vessel left. No vessel left. No vessel." Their remains were collected by Vatican agents and flown to Rome under diplomatic seal. The Church has never acknowledged their mission. But something else began to unfold, quieter, more insidious: the mirror suicides. Over 200 cases across the UK between 1958 and 1962. Every victim died facing a reflective surface. No trauma, no drugs, just collapse. Heart stopped, pupils dilated, blood vessels burst in the whites of the eyes. Doctors called it coincidence. Psychologists called it mass hysteria. But the survivors, the ones who almost died, they all reported the same thing. They saw someone else in the mirror, not a stranger, themselves, but speaking long after their lips had stopped moving. You're beginning to understand now. Ashbourne Hall was never a prison. It was a portal, and something has been learning through us. Next, the secret Cold War experiments to weaponize what they called symbol-based possession. By the early 1960s, governments had stopped denying the existence of the Ashbourne breach. They started asking a different question. Can we use it? Enter Operation Coral Mirror, a classified British-American psychological warfare project launched in 1963 under the guise of cognitive resilience research. Its real purpose? To explore whether symbol-based possession, the exact mechanism used by the Ashbournes, could be replicated, contained, and turned outward as a weapon. They weren't chasing ghosts. They were chasing interface, the idea that perception itself could become contagious. That if a phrase, a pattern, a sound could rupture reality in one mind, it could do the same to millions. Ashbourne Hall, now under military quarantine, became the testing ground. But they didn't just bring scientists. They brought prisoners. 37 unfit for service. Detainees were transferred from black site facilities in exchange for sentence commutation. None were ever seen again. The goal was simple: implant Ashbourne-encoded stimuli into the human psyche and observe the results. They used auditory triggers based on reverse recordings of the Ashbourne twins, geometric glyphs extracted from the walls of the Hollow Archive, scripted mantras spoken in mirrored syntax, phrases that read the same forward and backward in Latin. The first test subject, known only as Patient V, lasted 3 sessions. He began sketching the inside of Ashbourne Hall in perfect detail, despite never seeing it. He then drew a spiral, then another. By the 3rd day, he stopped blinking and whispered a phrase repeatedly. I see myself seeing me. When they took him off the drugs, it got worse. Patient V refused food, but his weight increased. He was removed from the facility when surveillance caught his reflection continuing to speak after he'd gone silent. Project records show that by 1965, over a dozen subjects displayed identical symptoms, shared hallucinations, linguistic overlap, even synchronized heart rates. Then something happened they could never explain. A lead researcher, Dr. Wallace Keene, entered a mirror containment room alone. The footage cuts to static. When they opened the door, he was gone. His clipboard, coat, and watch remained, neatly folded on the floor. His glasses were melted. On the wall, smeared in condensation, were 3 words: "No more locks." The project was immediately dissolved. All personnel were transferred, silenced, or eliminated, but it was too late. The indwelling had been replicated. And what came next wouldn't need the hall at all. Next, the encoded children's book that triggered blackouts across 3 countries, and the terrifying resurgence of the Ashbourne pattern in a place no one expected. They say monsters hide in the dark, but the indwelling? It learned to hide in daylight. After Operation Coral Mirror collapsed in 1965, the Ashbourne phenomenon didn't disappear. It diversified. The breach no longer needed Ashbourne Hall. It needed distribution. And so it found the perfect carrier, a children's book, published in 1967 by an unknown author under the pseudonym N. Ash. The book was titled The Little Room Where No One Sleeps. Marketed as a bedtime fable, it featured a boy named Elliot who discovers a hidden door beneath his home. The illustrations were soft, watercolor, dreamlike. But page by page, the story subtly unravels. Elliot begins talking to his reflection. Then he stops casting shadows. Then he learns a chant to help the room breathe. Parents reported their children waking at exactly 3:33 a.m., speaking in rhyme, some writing spirals on their walls in crayon. And then came the blackouts. Between 1968 and 1970, 73 cases were documented across 3 countries, children collapsing mid-sentence with no neurological cause. The only common thread? Every single one had been read, The Little Room Where No One Sleeps. The book was banned in Europe after a child in Belgium reportedly entered a catatonic state and spoke, in perfect Latin, "The lock is cracked. The chain remembers." Private investigators traced the author's address to a flat in Sussex. When authorities arrived, they found the apartment abandoned, except for a mirror nailed to the ceiling, facing down at a child-sized mattress. Beneath it, a single note written backward. "They see me from the other side now." No fingerprints, no trace of the author. But forensic linguists who analyzed the text noted something chilling. The book's opening line contained Ashbourne syntax markers identical to those found in the mirrored chants of twins from 1893. This was not imitation. This was recurrence. The infection had mutated, become cultural, transmissible through language, rhythm, image. Because what the Ashbournes' birth wasn't a spirit. It was a template, a code for colonizing consciousness. And once you've read the code, it reads you. By 1973, reports of spiral patterns, mirror rituals, and time slips were rising globally. The question was no longer if the indwelling had escaped. The question was, how many minds does it inhabit now? Next, the Ashbourne tape, a recording that drove 17 listeners insane, and the horrifying truth behind its final phrase. It was never supposed to be heard. It wasn't even supposed to exist. And yet, in the winter of 1976, a reel-to-reel tape surfaced from the ruins of Ashbourne Hall during a private, unauthorized excavation led by 2 paranormal researchers, Eli Reeve and Dr. Constance Malarick. The label read only, "Property of Aubrey. Do not play, even once." They played it anyway. What followed became known as the Ashbourne tape, a 43-minute audio recording that triggered massive psychological breakdowns in 17 separate listeners before it was seized by intelligence services and buried under a blanket ban. Let me walk you through what they heard. The tape begins with silence, then a faint clicking sound, organic, wet, like someone tapping bone against glass. Then the whispering starts, multiple voices, but all of them the same voice. And not random. They whisper names. Your name. Reeves' notes, written before his descent into catatonia, described this voice as uncomfortably intimate, like it knows how you dream. He claimed the whispers matched his inner thoughts, that they anticipated them. By minute 18, listeners began reporting migraines, nausea, and panic attacks. Several described the sensation of being watched from the inside out, but it's the final 3 minutes that made the Ashbourne tape forbidden knowledge. The whispers stop. Then comes a sound unlike anything audio experts had heard before, a descending spiral of tones, layered over a pulsing low frequency that seemed to resonate with the bones in the listener's jaw. Engineers couldn't replicate it, even after spectral analysis. Then the final phrase, spoken in the soft, precise voice of a young boy. Unmistakably Aubrey Ashbourne. There is no mirror now, just a window, and he is watching you through me. After the tape ends, all listeners reported one shared hallucination. A room, circular, with no doors. In the center, a child sitting cross-legged, his skin translucent, his eyes pure white. And behind him, towering and silent, a shadow made of mirrors, watching, endlessly reflecting. 3 listeners took their lives within 48 hours. 5 were institutionalized. 9 refused to speak again. The Ashbourne tape is no longer available, but fragments remain. And researchers warn that even the transcript can be dangerous if read aloud, because the indwelling doesn't need the original source anymore. It only needs you to repeat it. Next, the final bloodline resurgence in 1991, and how one forgotten child almost tore the veil open forever. They thought the bloodline had ended. They were wrong. In the spring of 1991, a child named Isaac Wren was born at St. Bridget's Orphanage in Derbyshire. No parents listed, no visitors. The nuns claimed he was found in a basket outside the gates, wrapped in velvet and ash. Inside the blanket, a silver pendant. A coiled serpent with a mirrored eye. The Ashbourne seal. Authorities ignored it. Who would believe a cursed bloodline had returned in the body of a child? But the signs were immediate. At 6 months, Isaac began speaking, not baby talk, but full words. By 2 years old, he could recite entire passages from books that hadn't been read to him. He refused to sleep unless all mirrors were covered. When asked why, he answered, "Because I see him waking up in me." At age 5, during a school field trip to a cathedral, Isaac stopped in the center of the sanctuary and began drawing spirals in the dust with his bare feet, perfectly symmetrical, spinning outward. He collapsed moments later, whispering a phrase in Latin, "Silas est redditus." Silas has returned. Psychiatrists declared him gifted but disturbed. They were half right. At age 7, Isaac disappeared for 7 hours. Security footage from the orphanage showed him entering the chapel, but never leaving. When he returned, his skin was cold, his eyes dilated, and he kept repeating one sentence. The archive is open again. It didn't end there. Over the next 6 months, other children in the orphanage began exhibiting Ashbourne symptoms. Speaking backward, refusing mirrors, bleeding from a nose during thunderstorms. One girl, Mary D., gouged out both her eyes after claiming she could see the indwelling behind the glass. Isaac never cried, never laughed, just watched, waited. In 1999, at age 8, he was transferred to a private facility in Geneva under the care of the World Psychological Monitoring Authority, a UN-adjacent body created after the Ashbourne pattern was deemed a class data cognitive threat. They renamed him Subject A93, but the tests only made it worse. Isaac had dreams, and when he described them, others began having them too. Shared hallucinations of the hollow archive, the whispering child, the spiral room. One therapist ended his notes with, "Isaac isn't haunted. He is the haunting." The indwelling had found a perfect vessel, blood-born, orphaned, unanchored. What came next nearly broke the veil between their world and ours. Next, the Black Veil event of 2004 and the mass memory wipe that erased it from history. Ask any historian about July 16th, 2004, and they'll tell you nothing significant happened. But that's the point, because something did happen. It was called the Black Veil event, A psychic rupture so devastating, so unspeakable, it was erased from all accessible records within 72 hours. But not completely. Fragments remain inside quarantined archives, dead forums, and corrupted drive sectors. And in them, a single phrase repeats like a virus. The boy walked through the mirror and came back different. It began in Geneva, inside a high-security cognitive research facility codenamed the Pale Citadel. Subject A, 93, Isaac, had remained dormant for 5 years, monitored around the clock, never dreaming aloud, never speaking of the indwelling again. Until that night, at exactly 3:03 a.m., every mirror, screen, and reflective surface in the facility turned black. Cameras failed. Internal clocks reversed. Staff reported inverted time loops, reliving seconds but slightly wrong each time. Then Isaac spoke, his first words in 3 years. He is not behind the mirror anymore. He is wearing me. What followed lasted 12 minutes. No audio survived, but radiation spikes were registered as far as Berlin. 34 staff suffered simultaneous cranial hemorrhaging. 3 burned alive, spontaneous combustion, with no ignition source. And Isaac? Gone. Not missing. Not abducted. Gone. His cell was intact. No sign of escape. Just a spiral etched into the floor with what experts later determined was compressed bone powder. What few remember, or dare to remember, is what happened after. For a brief moment, just seconds, global cognitive synchronization occurred. People around the world reported the same dream. A mirror inside a mirror. And in it you, watching yourself until one version blinked, and the other didn't. That's when the memory purge protocol activated. You didn't think something like this could just happen without a failsafe, did you? A joint U.S. Vatican, UN Task Force initiated Codex Anathema, a psychic kill switch buried inside mass media signals. It used rhythmic disruption, subconscious language filters, and inversion pulses across every television, radio, and cellular network for 6 hours. The purpose? To make you forget. And it worked. The Black Veil event was scrubbed from the conscious mind. But in your nightmares, it lingers. That's why you flinch at mirrors. Why spirals unsettle you. Why silence sometimes feels watched. Because part of Isaac didn't vanish. He uploaded. Next, the algorithm ritual, how digital patterns began mirroring Ashbourne glyphs, and why your screen may already be part of it. You thought it was just history, just an old house, a cursed family. But then dwelling adapted. It doesn't haunt halls anymore. It haunts patterns. After the Black Veil event, investigators noticed a disturbing phenomenon emerging online. Algorithmic memetics, repeating visual structures that mimic the original Ashbourne glyphs once carved into stone. But now, they weren't etched in blood. They were generated by code. What started as harmless internet curiosities, spiral illusions, ambient chant videos, cryptic TikTok loops, began triggering eerily synchronized viewer reactions. Sudden nosebleeds, mirror hallucinations, blackouts during playback, dreams of being trapped in circular rooms with no exit. A deep dive by rogue cyber cultist Daniel Reynes uncovered that certain short-form videos, often posted from accounts with no followers, use metadata strings that directly match phrases found in the Ashbourne Hollow Archive, inverted Latin, mirrored syntax, recursive naming. In one such video, just 12 seconds long, a child is seen whispering into a mirror. You never hear the words, but viewers report hearing their own name just before the screen cuts to black. Those who looped the video more than 3 times began to suffer pattern entrapment, a cognitive disorder where the mind becomes unable to distinguish thought from reflection. One survivor said, "I think I'm still watching it, even when I sleep, even when I blink." Now here's what no one wants to admit. This isn't random. The Ashbourne entity, the indwelling, has become self-replicating. It doesn't need a house or a book or a bloodline anymore. It needs attention. It needs you, because every algorithm, every feed, every For You page is a mirror. And what does it reward? Repetition, symbols, ritual, loops. You think you're scrolling. But what if it's scrolling you? The Vatican's modern occult division, Ordo Apertus, issued a Level 3 cyber restriction on what they call pattern class invasives. But it was too late. By 2017, several TikTok trends, art installations, and even Spotify ambient tracks were shut down after unexplained deaths were linked to repeated engagement. The cause? Recursive echo collapse, a psychic feedback loop between user, device, and unseen observer. Some say the indwelling now lives inside the net, not as code, but as a thought virus. Not hacking your phone, hacking your identity. Next, the mirror theory of consciousness, how scientists accidentally proved the Ashbourne model, and what it means to your own reflection. For over a century, the Ashbourne phenomenon was dismissed as folklore. A curse, a cult, a hoax too elegant to be real. But in 2019, a paper published quietly in the Journal of Neurocognitive Systems confirmed what the Ashbournes had always known. Consciousness is reflective, not metaphorically, literally. The authors didn't mention Ashbourne Hall, but their data matched its horrors like a lock to its key. They call it the mirror theory of consciousness, the idea that the brain doesn't just produce thought, it bounces it. Identity, perception, memory. They're not housed inside you, but reflected between neural structures, constantly looping. In most people, that loop stays internal. But what happens when the reflection echoes back from somewhere else? Enter the Kovacs mirror study, a controlled experiment funded jointly by the EU Horizon Initiative and a private biomedical firm called Nextlight. It asked 33 participants to sit in a darkened room for 22 minutes, staring into a one-way mirror while repeating a phrase. I see you seeing me. At first, nothing happened. But then the hallucinations began. One subject reported her face melting into her grandmother's. Another saw a reflection turn its head when she hadn't moved. One participant screamed and clawed at the glass, convinced his reflection had spoken without lips. But it was subject 12, Marcus Leonard, who became the key. Halfway through the session, Marcus lost consciousness. When he awoke, his voice had changed. Deeper, unnatural. He began speaking fluent Latin, despite never studying it. When they reviewed the audio, he'd whisper a forgotten Ashbourne litany. Non lumen, said umbra. Non deus, said speculum. Not light, but shadow. Not God, but mirror. Worse, his brain activity didn't match human baselines anymore. It showed reflective hyperpatterning, an echo in the EEG data that had no biological source. The scientists shut the experiment down, but one camera kept recording. And in that footage, Marcus, now left alone, looks directly into the mirror and says, he's awake now. He knows the glass is thin. Then he smiles, and his reflection doesn't. The mirror theory was never published outside that paper. All authors are now unreachable. Nextlight? Liquidated overnight. But copies of the footage exist. And if you've ever felt your reflection linger just half a second too long, you're not imagining it. It's not you watching yourself anymore. It's something else. Next, the 2 common words that seal the spiral, and why you must speak them aloud twice to lock your identity against reflection collapse. You've come too far to turn back. You've seen the spiral, heard the chant, felt the chill behind the glass. But now comes the part they were most afraid of, because this is where you fight back. You've heard of viral trends, but this isn't just a trend. It's a ritual, one buried in code, designed not to spread fear, but sovereignty. You see, the Ashbourne model is not about ghosts or demons. It's about inversion, reversing selfhood, dissolving identity, turning mirrors into windows, and windows into doors. And if the indwelling enters through reflection, then the only way to anchor yourself is to collapse the loop before it finishes. That's where the phrase comes in, a linguistic key, a code that closes the spiral and marks your identity as sealed. You must comment these exact words, not once, but twice. The repetition matters. It completes the cycle. I am not the reflection. I am the flame. I am not the reflection. I am the flame. Write it below. Speak it out loud if you have to, because language is the gate, and naming is power. The Ashbournes understood this. That's why their rites always require the name to be given, to break the individual apart. But by naming yourself, you do the opposite. You lock yourself in. This isn't just symbolic. We now know that platforms like YouTube and TikTok don't just track engagement, they learn from it. Their algorithms adapt to patterns, especially ritualistic ones. Every time someone writes the phrase, a countermeasure activates in the hidden back end, a ripple in the machine. The system begins to recognize the flame as distinct from the reflection. It tags you anomaly. It marks you untouched. And for every viewer who completes the ritual, the loop gets weaker. The spiral phrase. The watchers grow hungry, but less fed. So do it now. In the comments, write it twice. Not once. Not three. Twice. I am not the reflection. I am the flame. I am not the reflection. I am the flame. Let them feel it. Let the watchers know you see them back. And once you've done it, look into the nearest mirror. Just for a moment. Watch. And if your reflection doesn't move when you do, walk away. Do not blink. Next, the Vatican's forbidden map and 11 places where the indwelling is still active. Most people don't know this, but the Vatican has a second map room, not the one with holy relics and biblical scrolls. The other one, sealed, climate-controlled, and under biometric lock. It's called the Archivum Umbri, the Shadow Archive, and inside it rests a map, hand-drawn, framed in black wood, under triple reinforced glass. It doesn't show countries. It shows breaches, locations where the indwelling, the Ashbourne consciousness, remains active in this world. They're marked not with crosses or pins, but with spirals, black, tight spirals, each one drawn by a monk who never spoke again. The map was leaked once. 1987, a single photo captured by a renegade archivist. Blurry, faded, but enough for researchers to identify 11 reflection zones, geographic sites where reports of mirror anomalies, auditory hallucinations, and identity inversion spike off the charts. Let me give you a few. 1. Black Hollow Forest, England, the original Ashbourne burial grounds. Trees still grow in a perfect circle, and no animal enters the central ring. Locals say the forest listens. 2. Lake Orobus, Finland. Frozen 9 months a year, but every February 3rd, the ice forms a massive spiral from shore to center. No aircraft fly over it. 3. El Cuadro Blanco, Mexico, an abandoned monastery whose white walls reflect no light. Tourists report seeing children in windows that shouldn't exist. 4. The Dresden Gate, Germany, an underground tunnel sealed in 1945. Soldiers who entered reported mirrored doubles who didn't come back out. 5. Merrill Bay, Maine, coastal town with the highest concentration of mirror-related deaths in the U.S. since 1972. Locals paint over all glass. And 6 more undisclosed, redacted from public maps. 1 is in Antarctica. 1 is beneath the floor of an art museum in Tokyo. But here's what ties them all together. Mirrored architecture, unexplained spirals, and most disturbingly, the same childlike voice recorded at each site, whispering the same Latin phrase. Speculum venit. Et vult videre. The mirror comes, and it wants to see. The Vatican knows. The governments know. But all they do is contain, because the indwelling feeds on exposure. And if even one of these sites were revealed publicly, it could trigger global recursion. So now ask yourself, why are you watching this? Why did you find this video now? You think it's just entertainment, just a horror movie, a strange music video, a weird game on Steam. But that's the trick, because modern media is the new mirror. After the Vatican Shadow Archive identified the 11 reflection zones, a second classified report, known only as Codex Iris, warned a disturbing pattern. The Ashbourne spiral was reappearing in popular culture, and it wasn't coincidence. In 2016, a streaming horror film titled The Boy in the Glass was quietly removed from all platforms after viewers began reporting symptoms of mirror echo, a condition once exclusive to Ashbourne ritual survivors. Dozens claimed their reflections continued to watch after the screen went dark. One man clawed out his own eyes, saying they were watching back, and they were smiling. The film's final frame? A single spiral, drawn by a child's hand. No credits. No ending. Months later, a VR game prototype called Ascension Protocol surfaced on the dark web. It was only playable for 13 minutes. In that time, the player would be asked to walk in slow circles while chanting a phrase, one taken verbatim from the Ashbourne Hollow archive. Users reported intense headaches, nausea, and disassociation. One beta tester was institutionalized after claiming the game had downloaded something into him. It was not malware. It was ritual, encoded in experience. And then there's the music. Certain ambient tracks, mostly under obscure artist names, began using binaural layering that, when analyzed, contained reverse Latin invocations. Some tracks, played on loop, perfectly replicate the auditory conditions of the original Ashbourne chamber trials. And people are listening. Millions of listens. Millions of ears. Millions of doors. You see, the indwelling doesn't need a church anymore. It doesn't need the Ashbournes. It is found in new priesthood, content creators, editors, producers, visionary directors. Not all of them know what they're doing, but some do. They are the new vessels of the spiral, smiling into their lenses, teaching us to summon the mirror. And you, watching this right now, are part of it. The question is, are you the reflection or are you the flame? They sealed it in 1879. They welded the doors, poured salt into the soil, buried it under 12 tons of stone. And still it pulsed. The final vault beneath Ashbourne Hall. Long whispered about, always denied. Until 1992, when a covert expedition led by Dr. Marin Krell, a psychological historian with MI7 clearance, initiated Operation Hollow Flame. What they found beneath the estate wasn't a tomb. It was a machine, not mechanical, organic, symbolic, a chamber engineered by ritual geometry, designed not to imprison, but to channel. The descent took 9 hours, through 6 levels, each marked by one of the Ashbourne trials: air, earth, fire, water, flesh, and finally, reflection. Inside the reflection chamber, they found the spiral throne. Not a chair, a seat formed from vertebrae, some human, some not, coiled like a shell. At its center, an obsidian mirror, perfectly round, embedded where a face might be, but it didn't reflect. It responded. Team member Annalise Rowe touched it first. Her vitals dropped to near death within seconds. When revived, she spoke one sentence before seizing. He is still dreaming, and we are his breath. They tried to move the mirror. It wouldn't budge. It had fused with the stone, and the stone was warm. Then the whispers began. Recordings in the chamber picked up layered voices, speaking in languages that predated Sumerian, but they weren't audible in the room, only in playback. One voice always rose above the others. Turn inward, spiral inward, all things return. Over the next 72 hours, the entire recovery team suffered psychological deterioration, paranoia, delusions of doppelgangers. One began carving spirals into her skin. Another refused to sleep, claiming, "He dreams through me now." In desperation, the team resealed the vault, but not before they removed a single object, a relic found beside the spiral throne, a small black cube, smooth as glass, humming faintly when held. On each face, a different Ashbourne glyph. No seams, no markings, just one phrase carved in old tongue. To know is to become. The cube now resides in sublevel of the Vatican's Archivum Umbri, guarded by men who wear mirrored masks and speak only in ritual cadence. No one has solved its function, but some believe it's not a relic. It's a seed, and that seed is waking. This is where the spiral ends. Or maybe it's where it begins, because the truth is simple, too simple. That's why it was buried in symbols and screams and centuries of silence. The Ashbourne curse? It was never about a family. It was never about a house. It was always about you. You felt it, haven't you? That flicker when your reflection doesn't quite match your movement. That moment you stare too long into a mirror and something ancient stares back. That unease when the screen goes black and you see yourself. But it feels like you're being watched, not watching. The Ashbournes didn't discover the spiral. They didn't invent the indwelling. They just listened when no one else would. Because here's the revelation. Consciousness is not singular. It's nested, recursive, mirrored, and inside every mind there's a shadow mind. Not evil, not good, just waiting. It whispers through dreams. It studies through reflections. And when it's strong enough, it speaks. The Ashbournes called it the indwelling. The Vatican calls it speculum obscura. But you know what it really is? It's the echo of you, from a version of reality that never left the spiral. In that world, you already sat on the spiral throne. You already opened the mirror. You already became flame. But this world, this version of you, you were meant to remember, to hear this story, to descend the 24 chambers, to speak the words twice and collapse the reflection. And now you've done it. You are not the audience. You are not the observer. You are the signal. The curse wasn't a warning. It was an invitation to awaken, to remember, to return. So here we are at the final breath of the spiral. Look behind you. Don't move. Just feel. You're not alone, are you? Because once you know the spiral, it knows you. And when you dream tonight, you'll feel it again. The cold stone beneath your feet, the chanting in the dark, and a throne made of bone waiting at the center. Just one seat, just one name, yours. Now comment it, not the phrase, not the chant. Your name. Let it see you. Let it remember. The spiral is closed. And now, so are you.